All right, welcome back. This is part 2 of our video series about fair housing. And this next segment we're gonna learn about things like redlining. And redlining for sure is on this exam, so you definitely wanna know the definition. Don't forget that I have some questions that are integrated throughout this segment. I cut them in, so you sort of in appropriate spots where you can get the information right after you learn a little segment. So keep an eye out for those, as they're gonna help you get tuned and ready for this examination. Hope you enjoy this. This is Fair Housing, our second module. Look forward to teaching you, and good luck on your exams.
The Community Redevelopment or Reinvestment Act was primarily written to break up something called redlining. So redlining is something that you're definitely going to see on your examination. I'm going to say redlining is a very high probability, so we'll put a star by it, because that's one that you tend to see often with frequency. Now, the first thing we need to know about redlining is we need to know the definition. So let's frame out what the definition is for redlining. And then I'll explain to you why the Community Redevelopment Act was written. So basically, redlining is not making a loan or issuing an insurance policy in an area for reasons other than economic qualifications. By the way, you'll find this in your glossaries of your book. You'll also find it in Unit 18. But again, redlining is not making a loan in an area for reasons other than economic qualifications. So you have a lender and they're not making a loan, and they might not be making a loan for, let's say, example, protected class status. We don't want to lend money to people of a certain race, color, religion, national origin, because they might have a high probability of default or this or that or some legend and lore. So that's what these redlining definitions are. Redlining happens to be not making loans in areas for reasons other than economic qualification. So let's say, just as an example, let's say this like square represents the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the way lending works is you have one of two licenses if you're going to be lending money. You have a federal level charter if you're a federally chartered institution. An example would be Bank of America, would be JP Morgan, would be Chase, one of these guys, right? They're federally chartered. The other option is, if you're licensed to be a lender, you are licensed at the state level. So you're a state level licensed lender, or you're a federal level licensed lender, one or the other. There's no other lesser than that. There's no local, regional. If you're going to be lending in Massachusetts, you'll have a state level license, right? So let's say that this box represents Massachusetts and everybody in Massachusetts. And let's say we have a lender that has a minimum loan amount. Now, I can certainly tell you, being in the lending business for a while, making a loan that's very small is a pain in the neck. And the reason why it is because it's not very profitable. And yet, if depending on the type of loan and the type of property you're dealing with, let's say if it's a residential property, there are so many federal, state, and local disclosure requirements that it's just time consuming and not profitable. So lenders don't want to make small loans. They hate making small loans. They're never going to say that. They're never going to publish it in the news. But I was in the lending business, and I'm going to tell you, the amount of paperwork that it takes to do a $50,000 loan and the amount of paperwork it takes to do a $5 million loan, the $5 million loan being exceptionally more profitable, is almost the same amount of paperwork, missing like an extra appraisal or something like that. So we're talking about two loans and documentation that are going to rival each other, time consumption and everything else, yet profitability significantly different when it comes down to it. So I'm going to tell you, a lot of people are going to try to make the bigger loan versus the smaller loan.
The discriminatory practice of denying or limiting access to financial services in an area for reasons other than economic qualification is called letter A, steering. Letter B, blockbusting. Letter C, redlining. Letter D, market manipulation. And the answer is letter C, redlining. Okay, so look at this question is a word-for-word perfect definition of what is redlining. So I would study this. This is a word for word. So if you get one of the questions that are like, hey, what is this thing? This is an excellent version of that. You should also know that steering, all right, so steering and blockbusting are actually prohibited practices here in the United States. So you want to know what the definitions of these are so you can sort them out between redlining. But these three, redlining, blockbusting, and steering are all three definitely on examinations. Market manipulation, you can skip. That was like, just not important to this particular question. It's definitely that. You just needed to know what the vocab phrase was for this. Good question to get you started inside of fair housing.
Say in my hypothetical here, we have a lender and the lender is making a minimum loan amount. Let's say the minimum loan amount is $500,000. That's our minimum. So let's say, this circle here, this circle here, this circle here, this circle here. Let's say all of this are in areas like Boston and the surrounding concentric circle. And all of these areas, the average median home price is above that. So we know that the loan amounts here in this area are going to be easily met there, and that this minimum threshold isn't going to be a problem. But let's say if down here, these little circles down here represent, and these folks, I'll just, different color, these folks, these little dots inside of these areas, these are all people that live in Massachusetts, and they're all in these zip codes that happen to be in areas where the average median home price is more in line with the national average median home price. So let's say the average median home price, which is around $300,000, let's say there's a part of Massachusetts where the home values are around that of the average national median home prices. So we've got a pocket in Massachusetts where they don't need to borrow $500,000. If our minimum loan amount is $500K, they don't need that much. So let's say we get a phone call from one of these little red dots. Let's say this little red dot here calls us and says, hey, I'd like to borrow $185,000, and this person in this little area has good income, good asset, good credit, good employment, good everything, good property, everything else, so they would be qualified. However, we have a minimum loan amount. My question is, again, rhetorically a bit, but is that considered discriminatory? Is that a discriminatory policy? Am I redlining? Am I not making a loan in an area for reasons other than economic qualifications? So this person is economically qualified to borrow our money. We just don't want to make the loan to them because we don't want to deal with the smaller loan amount under $500,000. And the states are pretty much unanimous here. They consider that redlining. So you cannot have a discriminatory policy where parts of a community, in this case, the state of Massachusetts and those folks down in that lower quadrant area, were not being serviced. So the reason why they wrote the Community Reinvestment or Redevelopment Act was to break up this idea of redlining that's going to take place by not being able to service that community. And they found that something like a minimum loan amount would be a discriminatory policy. It's not overt. It's not, hey, I won't rent to the lease to these people, or I won't loan to these people because of a certain race, color, religion, national origin. It's more covert, where it's like we have this minimum loan amount and the average median home price here is below what we want to lend on. All right, so I want you to understand that redlining is one or the other. It could be anything, but it's not making a loan in an area for reasons other than economic qualifications. All right, so something like a minimum loan amount could be considered some kind of discriminatory policy. So again, redlining, you definitely want to know. And with redlining, you guys want to kind of understand what it is, and a scenario like a minimum loan amount would be considered redlining.
The law that encourages banks and financial institutions to meet the credit needs of low and moderate income neighborhoods and prevent discriminatory lending practices, including redlining, is letter A, the Community Redevelopment Act. Letter B, the Fair Housing Act. Letter C, the Civil Rights Act. Letter D, the Truth in Lending Act. And the answer is Letter A, the Community Redevelopment Act. This is, like the previous question, an excellent version of what is this definition and what is this law. So you definitely want to study something like this as you're getting ready for your exam. You also want to know little bits and pieces about the other laws. So the Fair Housing Act is definitely something that you're going to see on this examination. The Civil Rights Act. Now, the Civil Rights Act, is sort of twofold. Really important was 1866. You learn it in your real estate courses when you take them. Is the Civil Rights Act of 1866 barred race. And then there was the sort of, before they called it the Fair Housing Act in 1968, then they passed something, they were thinking about calling it the Civil Rights Act of 1968, but they decided instead to just call it the Fair Housing Act. Okay? All right. And then the Truth in Lending Act, you definitely want to know as well. So all of these are going to show up on examinations. I would know the definition of what the Community Redevelopment Act, and also important to note that this particular law deals with redlining, which we learned about in the previous question.
All right, so we've got redlining and we've got the Americans with Disabilities Act. Let me get out of there. Let me get rid of that. And let's take a look now at these other two laws and kind of go from here. So we've got those two minor ones are done, Americans with Disabilities Act and Community Redevelopment Act, the purposes of both and how they deal with their specific targets. I'll bring this over here. And then let's start talking about these other two that you're going to definitely see on your exam. The first one is the fair housing. So kind of let's jump into fair housing. I'm actually going to bring this up a bit, and then we'll just talk about fair housing for some time, and then we'll bring this back and we'll talk about equal credit and how it kind of rolls in. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to explain the dates that are popular on exams. So the first date is a date 1866. So in 1866, we passed something called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 said that we can no longer discriminate on the basis of race and property ownership. So all races in the United States were now eligible to own property. So ownership and property, so property rights and race. Civil Rights Act of 1866 dealt specifically with that. You guys want to know that the protected class that was added in 1866 was race. Now, because it was done away with so long ago, they say, and this is a popular question, I'm going to write Fed here and state here. So I'm going to write it like that. I want you to know if there are violations to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, I'll write 1866 here, we can take these directly to federal court. All right, so we need to list the federal and state enforcers for anti-discrimination. On the federal level, federal court lives inside of something called HUD. So for those that have never kind of had to deal with HUD before, now you need to kind of know what HUD is. HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So HUD is the biggest regulator that we deal with in the real estate business. And why are they the biggest? Because they oversee the operations of America's housing needs. So anytime we have the phrase America's housing needs, HUD has something to do with that. So that's the biggest. HUD oversees the operations of the FHA, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, Ginnie Mae, the VA, the USDA. It oversees all of this stuff. So everything lives inside of the belly of HUD, created out of the National Housing Act. Now, HUD is enormous, and one of the little things that it does in its enormity is it has an entire massive division of judges that deals specifically with anti-discrimination cases. So HUD employs judges just to listen, that sit on the bench just to listen to discrimination cases. Basically, that's what they do. So we've got HUD is the federal level enforcer. I'm asking you guys this question next. Does anybody know who the state level enforcer for anti-discrimination happens to be? If you don't, that's okay. You're here to learn. But do you know who the state level enforcer is for anti-discrimination? So the AG certainly gets involved, but on the recommendation of the enforcer. The enforcer will send it up the pipeline. Does anybody know where it starts? Kara says no. It's a good answer. So here in the state of Massachusetts, it's MCAD. All right, MCAD. Again, if you don't know this stuff, no big deal. I'm here to teach you, but sometimes people might know these, so we can use some deductive reasoning or something like that. So MCAD MCAD stands for the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination, MCAD. So the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. Popular test question. All right, so HUD or MCAD is the deal. But violations to the Civil Rights Act of 1866 can be taken directly to federal court. So you just want to know that there's this connective tissue here between HUD and race, and that race can be taken directly to federal level. MCAD is quite capable of handling race issues. Many times the representatives at HUD might even say, listen, if you're in the state of Massachusetts, MCAD could do this very easily as well. We're happy to take it. If it's anything else other than race, it has to go to MCAD. All right, so if it's something other than that. Now, where does the AG get involved? The AG, per the recommendation or the case being referred to the AG's office, it'll get stepped up and go in that direction. So the AG is the chief law enforcement officer in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for the state level AG. But as far as discrimination is concerned, it's all about MCAD in the state. So you'll see that one on your exam. So we've got 1866 and we've got race. Then in 1968, we decided to pass something called the Civil Rights Act of 1968, but then they decided, no, we don't want to call it that again. Let's just call this thing fair housing. So a pretty popular test question is, in what year did fair housing become law? The answer is 1968. All right, so the answer is 1968, fair housing becomes law. And again, a lot of these you can follow along with me in Unit 18 as I'm kind of detailing it. Now, what we did in 1968 is we decided to restate race. All right, so restate race. But then we decided to add 3 more protected classes. So race, color, religion, and national origin. You'll see these in your book as well in Unit 18 as you're looking. Race, color, religion, and national origin. So the original 4 protected classes were sort of added in. 1 was restated and 3 were added. Race, color, religion, and national origin. Now the story here of what happens next is, around this time, all of these laws for consumer protection were being written. And what the framers of the Fair Housing Act were being told is that, hey, listen, there's discrimination happening everywhere, and we've also identified it in the world of lending. And the lawmakers were, it was explained to them that there was discrimination on the part of banks taking place. And what banks were doing is banks were going to female borrowers and saying, listen, if you want to borrow money from us, you need to provide male co-signers if you want to borrow. Because what if you get pregnant? What if you leave the job force? What if you can't pay us back? So we'll loan you the money, but we want to make sure that you're going to pay us back. So therefore, you need to give us a male co-signer if you're going to be considered for a loan. So the lawmakers said that we can't do that. So they penned out the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and the prime protected class that they wanted to protect there was, females. So they added this category for sex. So the Equal Credit Opportunity Act is passed a few years after the Fair Housing Act. But again, it was primarily driven by this category, this protected class of sex, male, female. And then what they decided was, hey, listen, the framers of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, many of the same were the same politicians that framed out the Fair Housing Act, said, hey, look, fair housing has a couple of good ones. They have race, they have color, they have religion, they have national origin, and we have sex. And we would like to take these 4 from them. And the Fair Housing Act said, we have race, color, religion, national origin. We're going to take sex and we're going to add it as a protected class. And that's what they did in the 70s as well. So these 2 laws are an absolute sync. And that's why they're in red here. That's why, and I'll circle them or I'll frame them out for you. These 2 laws are in harmony with these first 5 protected classes. So unfortunately, they need you, or I need you, to memorize these protected classes, because you're going to see these on the exam. They're going to assume that you know these. There are only 7 protected classes on the federal level, so not a huge amount of memorization. Once you get these after a little while, you'll know them. But I just want you to know what the protected classes happen to be and how they're, where are they in sync and where are they different. That's what they also want you to know for this exam. So where they are in sync are the first 5: race, color, religion, and national origin. Race, color, religion, national origin, and sex. So get that part down first. And again, the only 2 dates we've talked about so far was 1866. That was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And then 1968 was the year in which they passed fair housing. All right. Now, let's talk about where they're a little bit different. So the Equal Credit Opportunity Act has 3 additional protected classes. These 3 stands for marital status. MS is marital status. A is age. And PA is public assistance. Public assistance. So the Equal Credit Opportunity Act is different because it protects age, marital status, and public assistance recipiency. The sex, S is for sex, male, female. So race, color, religion, national origin, sex are the first 5. Marital status, age, and public assistance are also covered under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Now notice, marital status, age, and public assistance are not protected under fair housing. This is stuff that we all kind of need to know. We need to know that marital status, age, and public assistance are protected. So in other words, if we're kind of reading between the line here, and we're looking at some test questions, here's an example. A married couple is discriminated against on the basis of that status. Is it a violation of the Fair Housing Act or the Equal Credit Opportunity Act? The answer is Equal Credit Opportunity Act. That isn't a fair housing violation because it's marital status. What about age? What if a 16-year-old applies for a mortgage loan and the minimum qualifying age is 18 for contractual capacity? What if a 55-year-old applies for a reverse mortgage, which is a mortgage product where the minimum qualifying age is 62? All right? Is that age discrimination? The answer is no. The 16-year-old applying for a mortgage loan or a 55-year-old applying for a reverse mortgage is not age discrimination. If there are these minimum qualifying ages, then that is okay to have, okay? So I want you to know if there are minimum qualifying ages and stuff, that is not considered discriminatory whatsoever. So again, just kind of knowing these a little bit, where they've asked questions before are those kinds of things. All right, let's see. So far we've got 5 protected classes that are in sync. We need to memorize them. They're in the red. Then we have a couple of protected classes that are in blue here, and these are the ones that they're not in sync. Marital status, age, and public assistance recipiency. By public assistance, the popular one that you need to know, the biggest rental subsidy, for example, rental assistance program in the United States is something called Section 8. So therefore, it would be discriminatory for a landlord or somebody on an exam, for an example, to say no Section 8. So if you see a test question like that where somebody says no Section 8, that's discriminatory. You can't say that. Now, the truth is if you go online and kind of troll a little bit through advertisements, eventually you'll come across ads in listing services that say no Section 8. It'll say it there. They are not in their right. They're violating the law. It happens constantly. And they can't do that, but they do it anyway, but it's discriminatory. So you want to understand that the reality of what you guys are going to see when you start to practice is that you're going to see that people will say, hey, no Section 8, we don't accept Section 8. Section 8 is just a rental subsidy. What ends up happening is it's for lower income applicants, it equalizes it. So in an area where market rents might be outside of their income capabilities, the Section 8 voucher program allows for them to live in those communities by equalizing and paying the difference. They pay up to a certain qualifying amount of housing expense, and the voucher program makes up the difference. That's Section 8. And you cannot advertise no Section 8. We don't accept Section 8. It would be discriminatory. All right, so something like that might be on your exam. Again, remember, there's a lot of little baby twists and turns here with anti-discrimination, just so you get it. Now, these 2 down here, one is familial status, and the D is disability. All right, disability. So we've got disability and familial status, and we're going to go into your book momentarily and kind of start highlighting away at some of this stuff, and we'll get them there. And I'm going to read to you a little bit about what is disability and what is familial status and stuff like that. So let's sort of get into that now that you guys have this idea. But you need to also know when disability and familial status were included, and that was the third date here, which is 1988. So there are a couple of dates that are very popular on this exam: 1866, 1968, and 1988. Now in 1988, when they added familial status and disability, they called this the amendments to the Civil Rights Act or the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So these were the amendments to the 1968 law. Now, some of you guys might be thinking, and it's the same thinking that I'd be thinking, is wait a minute, that's not all of the protected classes, is it? And on the federal level, the answer is yes, that's it. The Federal Fair Housing Act only covers 7. So there's only 7 on the Federal Fair Housing. So race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, and disability. So they passed this law, and they amended this law in 1988 to include familial status and disability, which we're going to read about in a minute. But I want you to understand that when the federal government passes an anti-discrimination law, it's up to the states on if they want to adopt that anti-discrimination as it's written, or they want to make it substantially more comprehensive for its citizens in that state. So with anti-discrimination like fair housing and Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the states can step in and say, you know, we want to add more protected classes. Or the states could come up and say, hey, these are fine. We're going to adopt these. This is the federal law. We'll keep it in line with the federal law. All right. So just so you know, there are states like Massachusetts that add more. So there are more protected classes, but just not on the federal level.
In lending, discriminating against which of the following categories would be considered redlining? Letter A, based on race or color. Letter B, based on religious beliefs. Letter C, based on a community's geographic location. Letter D, all of the above. And the answer is letter D, all of the above. Okay, so all of these would be lumped into what redlining really is. And, you know, the protected classes, the geography, the religious beliefs, all of which would be redlining if a lender isn't making loans in a particular area for these particular reasons. And that's what they're trying to say here. So if a lender isn't making a loan in an area based off of race or color, then they are violating the Community Redevelopment Act or Reinvestment Act. If they are basing their decisions off religious beliefs or on a community's geographic location, maybe everybody in this particular zip code has a high probability of default because the property values in the area are depressed, and therefore the people that live there may not be good qualified borrowers. Those would all constitute violations. So we want to know what redlining is for sure. I'm very confident that redlining is something that you see on real estate examinations, so look out for it.